It's a mafia. You're not like some people ask, well, once you got $1 billion, who cares about 10 billion? No. Once you're in the network, you have to keep providing value to the network. And you have to keep being compromised further. And if you try and exit the network, then you get Michael Jackson. What is the real utility of this? Well, this is telling the world we are moving to multipolarity. Everybody get on track. We'll reveal a bunch of stuff that weakens the dollar, reveals this, puts to rest some of these narratives, but everyone remain on track because we got the real stuff up here still, and that's still there. And Trump, I don't believe Trump controls it or the DOJ controls it.
You're watching CapitalCosm. My name is Danny. It is February 3rd, 2026. And my guest today is Simon Dixon. He's a Bitcoin OG investor and a macro analyst, a geopolitical analyst, and a financial analyst. Simon, what is there anything you don't analyze? I mean, you are just like a modern day Renaissance man.
Look, I just follow the money. I've worked in finance. I've invested in finance. I've built businesses around finance. 25 years I've been involved in finance, and I just do one thing, and it's follow the money.
Yeah, well, you do it really well. So I'm glad to have you on, and let's just dive right into the key stories here. We've got so much to unpack. I'm looking at the metals prices. They're currently rebounding, but who knows where they'll be, by the time this video comes out. So, it's extremely volatile right now. But I think what's pressing on everyone's mind right now, I don't know about you, but I would presume this is the case with you as well. My X feed is just littered with all of this Epstein file stuff, posts and all this other stuff. I want you to, kind of give us a high level view. What was the purpose of all of this? Why did they release these? I mean, there's obviously pressure to the administration to release the files, but why now? And they released about half of them. And they seem to implicate a good deal of elites, but also, there's also some ambiguity here and there. But yeah, what's the rationale? What do you think they released these files at this point in time?
Yeah, to answer that question, it depends on your understanding of who you think controls the Epstein files. From my understanding, I've always debated in my mind, because I've always believed government is subordinate to finance, military, and technical are the main factions of power that exist right now, the main lobbies that control governments. And at the very top, I've always said it's the financial industrial complex. I've wrestled in my mind whether the military industrial complex via the deep state control the Epstein files or whether it's the financial industrial complex. But I've never believed it was the government that has full control over these files. Now, obviously, the FBI gets to go through them, but the actual decision to release them, I think it goes layers above government. And so one thing you'll notice is that I think this is a part of the metals conversation, the currency conversation, because this essentially dismantles and gives confirmation to all the quote unquote conspiracy theories, whether it be, terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, whether they're controlled by Western intelligence, that's confirmed through these conversations, whether it be that Jeffrey Epstein was communicating with the higher levels of technology executives, military executives, financial executives, foreign leaders, royal families, monarchies. This is all confirmed. So you can pretty much take your conspiracy theory and you can find the credible ones have some kind of confirmation that this is how the system works. And so how do I interpret that? Well, I interpret that as effectively dismantling everything that propped up the dollar. And so to me, when you take on the deep state, when you reveal the deep state, nobody's going to be arrested. The system's still going to work as it is. The same transnational capital will control, these global geopolitical moves. But you effectively weaken the fabric of what made belief in the dollar globally and also internally. And so one thing you'll notice is that the trust in the system, it is an all-time low. and people don't trust any of the fabric that made, the empire the empire. So to me, I believe that these releases were from the factions of power within the financial industrial complex at the highest level that is telling Department of Justice what they're able to release and what is unacceptable, but revealing how the system actually works. And I think that's strategically another financial weapon of mass destruction to push this world into this multipolar world. And it kind of coincides with my market analysis. That's what I think is happening here. Now, on that, there is obviously, lower down characters like Thomas Massey that brought the case forward, and then a bit of geopolitical theater on both the left and the right to get the case to pass. And then you have the judicial side making sure it actually happened. And then you have the theatrics of, Trump saying it's a Democratic hoax, everybody taking their narrative, we're the most transparent. And so it gives everyone the ability to feed the algorithms, push out all this information. And no one's going to really go to prison unless they're an asset that needed to be disposed of. But you've completely weakened the entire system that propped up the dollar and made America the global hegemon, and kind of exposed all these different types of constructs. You got to combine that with the fact that you've got USAID being dismantled. Now it will be replaced with something else that serves another agenda. But these were really where the covert operations happened. National Endowment of Democracy. This is where you would have the colored revolutions and you'd recruit these militia groups in order to overthrow governments and funnel the funds via USAID to prop up the covert operations and destabilization campaigns. You've got United Nations being bankrupted, deconstructed. United Nations was where the great powers and America primarily got to veto vote and basically control narrative. And so taking out United Nations, while it looks like MAGA, it looks like what you would say to achieve popularity, but actually it's deconstructing and weakening the dollar. And then you've got to combine that with all the central banking operations that we're seeing right now with all these financial flows.
And one of the things that we uncovered with the Epstein files was there was an email talk where Epstein, I believe, was talking about how Davos would be a worthy replacement of the UN. Where does that kind of fit in line with what you're seeing here as well? Are we deconstructing the UN, the global world order? Will Davos be the substitute to that?
Yeah, I think World Economic Forum and Davos is where business leaders communicate, in order to get the lower down people that aren't involved in the backdoor conversations to directionally move with where capital flows is sending. And there were several things that came out of Davos. You had this, you kind of had this move and a confirmation that we're in a multipolar world, which is like we're now arrived there. And that confirmation, you had the border peace, which to me is a construct that comes from the pillar of once, Palestine is liberated and the Greater Israel Project is no longer expansive to destabilize the Middle East, then you've really set the regions. And also with the Russia-Ukraine side, once you take these big battles and also Iran, and you resolve those, which is what I think we're in, you've effectively broken up the sphere of influence. And the only thing that was stopping those wars previously was because the global hegemon benefits from war. War was a big part of the US stock pump. And so if you're going to be pulling back from those roles, handing it over to strategic partners at BRICS and the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, then you need a organization to effectively allow the empire to look strong while it's shrinking to regional power. And then you have this ability to take all of the different negotiations that have been happening in this transition to multipolarity, put them through the border peace, and then say, you know, we, the American empire, we're creating peace as it exits from these wars that were propping up the dollar before. And so, you know, you got that. And then you had all the different arguments between, you know, Europe kind of pushing towards China, which supports BRICS, another movement to multipolarity, Canada pushing towards BRICS, but also the narrative that, you know, America is strong. It's the bully. And so both narratives where Trump is saying, we are strong, we took Venezuela, we're going to take oil from Iran. You know, you got strength on the one side of the narrative. And then on the other side, they're saying America's the bully, but America's still strong. So it's pushing this show strength as, you know, while you shrink to regional power. And Davos are definitely, you know, the leaders at Davos are definitely, you know, running the show here and pushing this narrative towards multipolarity. Lots of conversation around energy, which is all the AI and robotics. And just really confirmation. And also the Pentagon published, you know, its new security policy, which really confirmed this multipolar world. It de-emphasized, you know, China as an adversary. It kind of pushed that Europe's not that important. It said that, you know, Iran, Russia, North Korea, and China, they're no longer the major threats. We need to focus on internal policies and internal harmony and the Western Hemisphere. And so we've had the new security policy. We've had the United Nations deconstruction. We've had World Economic Forum, you know, signal all of this stuff. And then we see the Epstein files that kind of discredits the system as long as the financial, you know, the only central bank in the world that's increasing rates is the Bank of Japan. Break the Japan carry trade. NATO is draining all these petrodollars by escalating, you know, the Russia war, continuing that narrative. America pretending they want peace when the military-industrial complex wants to suck up all those euro dollars into the military stocks. Increase in the budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion for military. Just really rolling over, even regime changing the Federal Reserve in order to make sure that you're getting this massive budgets, massive fiscal dominance, weakening of the dollar and pumping of the US stock market. And of course, as the dollar weakens, that breaks the currency pegs, and it also means that the even things like, we just got confirmation right now that much of the oil of Venezuela is being shipped and refined over in the Gulf countries, you know, which is then being purchased by China. And so you can really see this transnational capital in all these operations.
Interesting. You mentioned that all this stuff was connected. The Epstein files, the metals market behaving the way it has over the last week or so. The nomination of Kevin Warsh. Let's go back and take it to the metals market. You mentioned that earlier in the dialogue. How is what's happening in the metals market connected to the Epstein file dump?
Yeah, well, what did we see? I'm not sure they're necessary. They're all part of a longer term directional operation rather than the day-to-day minutia. But essentially, we had this massive, you know, so you know, treasuries are being sold by foreign central banks. Domestic purchases of US treasuries, you know, at shorter and shorter rates. The long term treasuries are not what's fulfilling most of the rollover. They're getting shorter and shorter duration in order to fulfill. And the demand for treasuries, you know, it's still there. The bills, the shorter term duration, like we've had massive auctions, but they've been mainly domestic. It's been mainly, you know, we've gone from QT to a little bit of QE. We saw some distress in banks as well, which is a bit suspicious. We should talk about. We also, you know, are seeing these very large Cayman Island holdings, domestic holdings. But the point is that it's being rolled over domestically rather than via these foreign institutions. Now, the financial industrial complex is using that opportunity to take some of these foreign treasury holdings, you know, sell their holdings, sell the dollar, buy their local currencies, invest it in their local bonds like JJBs in Japan, repatriate some of that capital. But we've had about another 4,500 tons added to central bank reserves outside the US. And that's not including what China's doing and all the stuff we don't know about, through the shell companies and stuff. But reported, we've had approximately, 4,500 tons of gold added to central bank and the central bank's balance sheet. And the percentage of foreign reserves in US Treasury is down to about 40% now. So the largest holding of foreign central bank reserves is gold, which officially marks the start of gold being the world reserve currency again. Not a currency, but a reserve asset, let's say. While all of these different fiat currency rails are being built. Now, I do think that some major bank, and we don't know who was on the wrong side of the trade yet in the silver short squeeze that pumped the price of silver, like unbelievable volatility, unbelievable directionally upside and then back down. And, we're seeing wild swings in gold and silver through this transition.
$10 swings in a single day on the part of silver. Yesterday we were down at like 72, got up to 88. So that was like a $16 swing. But yeah, volatility has been ramping up. It's just going back and forth with the buyers and sellers.
Yeah, unprecedented. And also the arbitrage between the silver in China versus the rest of the world. So, the silver market with this structural deficit, because 60% is needed for industrial use, it is really becoming apparent. And we don't know who was on the wrong side of this trade. Whether it was a genuine industrial player that was using futures market to hedge the fact that it had such a pump, and then it pumped further and further and further, and then they weren't able to deliver in that time. Whether this is the financial industrial complex using, massive amounts of volatility to try and get more silver from somebody else, whether it's a large bank and institution that managed to get some of those Federal Reserve bailouts in the background, or whether they're just repositioning this hole over to some hedge fund. We don't know the story yet. We don't have transparency on it, but somebody is on the wrong side of this trade. And volatility seems to be the mechanism for trying to bankrupt somebody and make sure that the bank's balance sheet is okay. Because, the banks are going to reposition themselves if JP Morgan was on the wrong side of this trade. And even if they can't get on the right side of it, they'll still obviously do a bailout into fiscal dominance, socialize the losses, privatize the gains. So the banks are going to be fine. But there is something going on in silver, and we don't know what it is yet. And I think that silver, silver's a bit more difficult because it's an industrial trade. But gold, don't fall for this volatility. If you're getting these wild swings, I still think we've got a lot further to go in this trade. And remember, as the dollar weakens, you have these different psychological shifts around gold as a unit of account in people's minds. For example, our business, we've always dollarized our business because it's been on the strengthening trade. But that 15-year bullish, gold outperforming other currencies is coming to an end. That trend is broken now. So immediately you start thinking about, okay, what are we going to do instead of dollarizing? And so you start looking at things like gold stable coins, or you start looking at how you can store your value in gold, but what are you going to hold your day-to-day payments in? And so immediately we look for something like a gold stable coin or something. We hold reserves in Bitcoin and stuff, but a gold stable coin. And then you go to your staff and you'll start saying, look, your currency is losing value to the dollar. Would you like to be paid in a gold stable coin? And of course they say yes. And so then people start thinking about, how do I price my goods in golds? And you start psychologically trying to think how things are valued in these different, commodities. And that takes a long time, because psychologically we understand value in terms of a currency. But these things are starting to have impact, and the longer and longer that you get these commodities, foreign currencies, and foreign stocks outperforming US still pushing all the money printing into the markets, you get these psychological shifts that really change the game. So it's still a commodities game.
Yeah. Well, you make a great point. We've got people are beginning to shift their mindset from a fiat currency unit of account to a gold unit of account. One thing in particular is the markets. We like to think of the markets as being at an all-time high. Now, if you price the markets in gold terms, we've actually been crashing. The market's actually down 30+% priced in gold. Here's your S&P divided by gold. And this is logarithmic, but if you look at it from a linear scale, the last big top we had was in 2000. And we've been dipping lower since, around 2024, the beginning of 2024 here. Looks like it's from the top here, you're looking at a 50% drop in priced in gold terms.
Yeah, correct. And what you're also seeing is, if you do the same for Bitcoin as well, it's become apparent that, in its current form, Bitcoin is not, following the gold trade of what people think it will do in these times of distress. The reason is because we haven't had a custody crisis yet. Like, now with gold, everyone's finding it very clunky it's impossible to get physical, really, really hard at scale. And so we're at some stage going to have, a crisis in terms of paper contracts and custody, which is kind of like the Bitcoin story. But you'll notice that at the moment, Bitcoin seems to be a leading indicator for the AI and tech trade. And so what I think happened is, the AI and tech side was dominating the indexes, and it was getting out of control. And it requires, with the exception of Google, the companies that can actually have the cash flows, most of the other companies like the ChatGPTs and the NVIDIAs and everyone, they're kind of playing this circle of contracts with each other. And they've created an environment where they have to raise unbelievable amounts of finance to continue that data center build out. This was causing a structural problem within private credit markets, where it's predominantly being funding, and obviously private credit is a function of one's ability to borrow from the bank as well. And so while you're getting these longer term interest rates, that seem to be plateauing or going up, on the shorter side, they're still trying to get those rates down. And so this is what I think the regime change at the Federal Reserve is. They need to unlock the private credit market. That is, a function of the bank market at the other side of that. And they need that significantly invested into these AI data centers. And so this is causing a little bit of stress and problems. And so, that's why I think it was really, really important that the administration or there was an internal battle between, kind of the traditional orthodox banks versus how to get money into these data centers and the traditional asset management play. And so we had this battle. It was like, are we going to get, Rick Reeder from BlackRock, the chief investment officer? But instead, we got the Epstein boy that was on the Epstein files, Kevin Walsh. And I think, this is a commitment to get those rates down. And it's all about getting that money into these data centers to do the AI and robotics trade. Nothing stops that train. I know some people think that, but what we saw, I think, is a correction, a recognition that this is an energy and oil play, which had its impact on the commodity play. But now we've had this correction in AI and tech dominance and the Magnificent Seven. I think leading into the Fed regime change and the lower rate cycle, is going to return back to dominance, because these are geopolitically strategic. They'll blow the whole economy to try and make sure that this data center and energy build out happens, because they're building this whole police state and surveillance state. mechanism. And so I think Bitcoin is kind of following that right now, but it could become more like a gold story when we have a custody issue. And if we get any issues with like a force majeure or something, where they cash settle any of these silver contracts, I think people are going to understand the importance of self-custody and the challenges of doing that at scale with some of these physical commodities.
What do we know about Kevin Warsh aside from the fact that he's present in the files? But we had an entire year of just Trump roasting Powell for not cutting rates, and now he brings in the guy who's supposedly one of the most hawkish nominees out there. And I tuned into I tuned into the CNBC landing page. And, one of the big headlines that they had to explain the gold and silver crash last week was that it came as a result, or it was like somehow correlated with the nomination of Kevin Warsh, which is absolutely asinine on its face, as if one Fed governor can actually have that much impact. Not governor, but Fed chair could have that much impact on the metals complex. Because it wasn't just gold and silver. It was the entirety of the metals complex. And they've been moving in tandem for a while now. Even before the crash, you were starting to see lithium break out. You're starting to see nickel break out, rare earth metals break out, platinum break out. All these things were signaling that it was go time for a major run in commodities. The only laggard was energy. But energy has been fairly resilient even despite the crash here. We've still been we've been range bound 60 to 65 on WTI oil. But what do you anticipate with Kevin Warsh coming down as the new Fed head? And is this another head fake? Are they going to do a little switcheroo maybe before they actually get to the actual nomination?
Yeah, well, all to speculate on, really. I do know that we have set up the story, which is that interest rates need to come down. Nothing stops this train. I do believe that is the strategy. And at the last, FOMC or the Fed meeting, we had 8 votes that leave interest rates and 2 that were looking for jobs, cut rates, despite all the data kind of not really conforming to that narrative. And so, I do think this is kind of another attack on Fed independence, which strategically, again, weakens the dollar, but also pushes the fiscal dominance story. What becomes quite interesting here is that now that we've entered into, this very late phase debt cycle in the US, you really have all eyes and all attention on this cut rate significantly narrative. And if you don't follow that, then we're going to have, real rampant speculation around mismanagement of expectations. So I think it plays into a volatility play. I personally, if I were to speculate, I think he's there to cut the rates when the data doesn't match. But also at the same time, strategically, the Fed can decide to go against what he's supposed to do. And that will have a real big impact in some of these capital outflow operations. So I think, again, it's a checkmate for the financial industrial complex to have a compliant Fed chair that will kind of optimize based upon bank policy and what is needed in managing this transition to multipolarity.
And what if the 10 and 30 don't respond in accordance to their cutting of the Fed funds rate? Will they just monetize the debt at that point? Will they go that far?
Well, I think it's all about monetization and pushing towards QE. Nothing stops this train. You got to print the money. I don't know any other strategy. Is sacrifice the dollar, print the money, roll over on the short term, and then if that's not, if inflate away the debt is the only strategy from here. And if the bond market doesn't like it, then you can utilize that to manage these massive capital outflows and push the world into this multipolarity. And I do think that that even you can connect that to the border peace. The border peace is, we know that all the deals have kind of been negotiated between the world powers. Who's going to take over the key port? Who's going to take over the key routes? What does the oil flows and gas flows look like? All the world leaders, knowing where we're going, have negotiated all of that. And anytime they want to make the announcement, they can kind of say, well, Trump was forcing us in order to get to world peace, and here's the announcement. And then you can combine that with finance being able to reposition and front run those capital outflow positions, or dump some of their positions accordingly, while the border peace is the mechanism for doing the announcement. And I think, again, Trump is fully aligned with transnational capital and global finance more than any other faction of power.
Interesting. Who's been buying the debt up until this point? Because it's not Japan. China's out. Who's been buying? Who's been keeping the 10-year yield at, range bound at 4.2, 4.3% now for like 3 years now?
Yeah, well, it's you don't get full transparency on it, but we do know that Cayman Islands holding seems to continually be increasing, which I think is domestic and internal, and transnational capital. Look, they don't want to lose treasuries as their as their collateral. This is something they still want to manage, but at the same time they're hedging their global markets as well. And so, yeah, the foreign central banks aren't buying. And I think this is all around the deregulation of 401ks to make sure that some of those lower interest rate, shorter term bills can be put through these 401ks. You got Cayman Island, which is, we don't know exactly what's happening here. But the buyers of last resort before the Federal Reserve, they seem to be sucking up some of these auctions as well, the discount brokers. But in the end, we know who the final buyer is. It's the Fed.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and take it geopolitically. You mentioned the Board of Peace, and now there seems to be a return of negotiations between Iran and the United States. Now, quick pause. This portion of today's episode is sponsored content brought to you by Apollo Silver Corp, APGO on the TSXV. If you're stacking silver or already positioned in silver stocks, you know the macro. The real question now is where the leverage is. That's where Apollo stands out. Apollo controls the Calico project in California, one of the largest undeveloped silver resources in the United States, with over 125 million ounces measured and indicated, plus another 57 million ounces inferred. That kind of scale matters, especially in a cycle where capital is rotating towards large US-based ounces. With the gold to silver ratio still hovering around 47-1, silver doesn't need heroics to re-rate, just mean reversion. And when silver moves, big, clean silver projects tend to reprice first. So for silver stackers, this is the equity side of the torque. Leverage exposure to silver without adding another monster box to the save. For stock investors, this is a pure play U.S. silver story at a time when silver and critical minerals, geopolitics, and domestic supply chains are driving valuation. Calico also hosts barite and zinc, both designated critical minerals, adding optionality and strategic value beyond silver alone. And importantly, this is a team with experience, management that's been involved in billion-dollar exits in past cycles. So once again, this segment was sponsored by Apollo Silver Corp, APGO, and the TSXV. And now let's get back to the video. Oh, I know. People sometimes have short-term memories, but I remember the last time Iran and the U.S. were negotiating. It was right before the 12-day war. What do you make of these new developments coming out of the U.S.-Iran relationship? Are they just waiting for the carrier strike groups to get into place? Is this a legitimate, honest-to-God negotiation, or is there something else at play here?
Yeah, so it's important to break it down into a bit more nuance. My interpretation of the situation, and you're quite right. If you look at the last 12-day war, you had this narrative around Trump was posting on Truth Social, we're in negotiations. You had the reform within Iran, you have IRGC, which would be associated with the more military hardliners, and many of the theological, like the more religious type of narrative that's pushed out about Shia expansionism and Islamist sponsors of terrorists and all that type of stuff. Those narratives, which we know is a Western operation now from the Epstein files. And we know from Iran-Contra affair that there's more cooperation between US hardliners in Iran and Israel as well. That strategic tension between Iran and Israel made the military-industrial complex a lot of money and destabilized the region. So you have those hardliners. And if you remember, there was a negotiation between the Reform Party. The helicopter came down, the previous president was taken out, and we had this reformist faction. Now, I believe they are fully aligned with China, and China at the moment is negotiating with America, or at least the financial industrial complex, and they're all co-investing via these sovereign wealth funds. So that transnational capital of American finance, sovereign wealth funds, and China are fully aligned. Now, what's happening? What happened last time is that you have, and that's aligned with the reform side of Iran, which then has the more IRGC side, which is the narrative. What they were doing is Trump set up a narrative from negotiations. And so the negotiations were, all right, you're not allowed a nuclear program. And so there was this whole debate around, do we do it at 2%, 60%, 90%? And so they were debating around the nuclear enrichment. Iran agreed that they would reduce their nuclear enrichment, and they had essentially a deal. And then suddenly Steve Witkoff came out and changed the terms and said, you can't have any ballistic missiles and you can only enrich uranium to 2%. And so what it did is it created the narrative in the media, war on, war off, war on, war off. And then suddenly you had a preemptive strike from Israel. Israel took out some of the generals and the nuclear scientists and various hardliners. And then Iran, for the first time, responded with, large aggression. And that took out some of the Mossad assets. It took out, within Israel, it was illegal for you to film and post any videos, and you'd get arrested. But there was, for the first time, America allowed Iran to do significant damage within Israel. Their debt to GDP went up to like 70%. They had to close their port. They got downgraded by all of the credit rating agencies. Even later, then you started seeing deals between Israel and Egypt to create strategic dependencies. UAE started investing in the aerospace industry, acquiring more of the assets. And so essentially, you've got this vassalization strategy within Israel to essentially make dependencies upon its neighbors. Now, within the IRGC side, you had many of the hardliners taken out. And then America got to show strength and say they came over with the B-52 bomber. Now, the nuclear, you could see, even in the hash power with Bitcoin mining, we had this massive drop right before the bomb dropped. And we also had these satellite images that they were moving parts of their nuclear program. But the B-52 bomber came, and then we had this massive AI footage in America saying we took out the program. Now, they did do some damage, but it definitely didn't take out the program. So then we had Israel basically drained all of its defense. Iran demonstrated that for the first time, you can actually, take on Israel more aggressively. And then America got to say, we took out the nuclear program. So after 12 days, they all took a victory lap and everybody said they won. So to me, and then it ended when we had this strategic strike from Iran on Qatar, and then it led to, you know, Qatar intervening and everything quietened down. But what they tend to do before these operations is set up the narrative for on off. So there it was, nuclear enrichment. Now what they did is they did an Operation Ajax 2.0. If you haven't read, you can go and check out Operation Ajax. It's essentially where you create. Scott Bessent came out and said that he did a currency war. So he destroyed the currency. All of the savings of the average Iranian was wiped out. You then had this inflation that had a big spike while the currency was weakening. That was a Scott Bessent hedge fund financial industrial complex intervention. That led to the normal protests based upon economic circumstance from the different markets that could no longer trade because of this inflation. Obviously, the distress was caused from the sanctions previously to put it in this position. And then you had an infiltration by Mossad, very similar to Operation Ajax. If you look at Operation Ajax 1, that was when CIA and MI6 basically took over the media, started manufacturing violence, started shooting at the leadership in order to lead to a regime change. And then they could take over the oil because they were, you know, at that time it was about British petroleum. We had the exact same operation. Now, we had all of the different media really pushed in order to create this narrative. Okay, so you are asking people to come up against the military, the IRGC, which are a ruthless military. And all the media was pushing people to start standing up against them. Now, we know from operations like in Syria that the only time you get the regime change is when the army is on board to meet the revolutionaries and world powers have already said that it's okay and Assad will be regime changed. In this case, IRGC weren't on board in that. So the media was pushing people to rise. There was no military support. You were asking people to come against the military. That's never going to work. Revolutions only happen when the revolutionaries join the military change sides, and then you coup the regime. And so that led to a massive amount of, of what the media was saying as deaths. Now, Iran said there was about 3,000. The media was saying 50,000, like 30,000, 100,000. And then you had all these people saying, you know, it's genocide and all of that type of stuff. So it was very, very similar to Operation Ajax. And so we saw that again. But it created the narrative that Trump needs, which was they're killing people. Oh, they agreed not to kill people. They're killing people. Oh, they agreed not to kill people. And so that's what you need in the negotiation. They set up the narrative. And now we're getting that Trump will post, yes, Iran, IRGC said they won't do it anymore. So that led into this. And then we got this ambiguity because things are going back and forth. What I think this operation is a continuation of the 12-day war, which is the world leaders, including the reform elements of Iran, have agreed that Iran is going to be vassalized into China because effectively Iran is economically 100% dependent on China buying its oil right now. If China stops buying its oil, then Iran will have serious, serious problems. And so they have created this dependency, and China has been leveraging with the Reform Party and then negotiating with the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, who are aligned with the American financial industrial complex, to vassalize and economically vassalize Israel into the GCC. Then eventually American military will stop supporting it. And Palestine and Israel will eventually be kind of normalized into the GCC. That's what I think the operation that transnational capital has negotiated and are trying to execute right now. That requires the purge of the militias, which I think is hardliner IRGC, which is if there's another tit for tat, it's because essentially I think the reformists are outsourcing to Mossad and America to take out some of the hardliner IRGCs. I don't think Khomeini is going to be taken out. We'll see. I don't think that needs to happen or will happen. And at the same time, you need to de-radicalize the Zionists and you need to de-radicalize the Jewish Zionists in Israel and the Christian Zionists in America, which is, to me, what the result of the Jeffrey Epstein files does. It connects these operations to pedophilia and sex trafficking, so that the Christian Zionists need to ask themselves, am I okay with this? Essentially, it's starting to defang some of these radical Zionists, some of these covert operations, and in the mind of the average American, recognizing this is completely illegitimate and immoral. And so I think I see the connection between these different types of operations, and the transition. And it's a messy operation. This is decades and decades. But what we're seeing around the Middle East is the purging of all the hardliners across all the different region, and the elimination of proxies and replacing with real standing armies. So you got a normalization between Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and Turkey's a real army. Egypt as well. So you're now starting to see these allegiances between UAE and India, while Pakistan, China, are having these allegiances. So everything's pointing to me, proxies are coming to an end, and these are kind of the final operation. And I'm not sure how long it will take, but again, nothing stops this train. Effectively, Iran is going to be in the Chinese BRICS sphere of influence, which is why Iran joined BRICS, and Israel is going to be in the GCC sphere of influence. And then maybe this is just to even take out some of the American military bases, as agreed by all regional parties. We'll see. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I do think the outcome is that this is an effective transitional exit of America from the Middle East and replacing destabilization campaigns with genuine defense contracts and real regional stability.
What do you make of this notion that some are saying that the Epstein files were released on Friday? No coincidence being that we've been on the verge of an Iran strike now for a couple of weeks now. The strike groups are getting into place and all this stuff. What do you make of this idea that the Epstein files were used as a pressure tactic to get Trump to take action on Iran? Because they did withhold half the files. They still have, they released 3 million. There's another 3 million that they haven't released yet. And some people are saying it's a mechanism to pressure Trump to pull the trigger on Iran. And then there's other groups of people that are saying that it's the opposite. It's Trump released the files to back the war hawks off. So I want to think on that.
I think both narratives are cartoon narratives. I think there is a cartoon narrative that Israel rules the world and that Mossad is in charge of everything, and that Netanyahu is the leader of everything. There is an alternative narrative that Iran's the resistance, and that's one. And then another narrative is Trump is taking down the deep state and taking on Israel. All of those are cartoons. The real narrative from following the money and looking at what's happening with like oil routes, investment contracts, border peace, different negotiations, normalizations. If you follow all of that doesn't make headlines because it's not sexy and it's not interesting and it's not sponsored by narrative through propaganda, you'll I think come to the conclusion that transnational capital controls the Epstein files. Both Netanyahu and Trump are subordinate. And the way that these operations, I think it's worth taking a bit of time to understand what these operations are. Because I think people think that this is like, oh, Mossad controls the Epstein files and they're using it to blackmail America. And then AIPAC controls all the politicians. That was a deliberate reveal, I believe, in order to eventually, and this isn't Trump playing 5G chess. Trump is subordinate to this power structure. So what are the Epstein files? There's not a chance in hell that a person called Jeffrey Epstein knew that levels of people and can connect to that many people globally of importance. Not possible. There's also no chance that he was just somebody that he was sick and twisted. That's completely true. But he wasn't just somebody that was involved in sex trafficking. This is a demonstration of how power really works in the real world, which is that the higher you want to go in power, the more compromised you have to be. And so what Jeffrey Epstein is a compromised network for real power. It's how you control governments. It's how you control leaders. It's how you control technical executives of tech companies, executives of military companies. It's how you have leverage within the deep state, the intelligence apparatus. So Jeffrey Epstein was constructed and manufactured. He wasn't a genius financier at Bear Stearns that became a billionaire. He was implanted into Bear Stearns. He wasn't somebody that was incredibly wealthy managing a family office. He was managing the family office of Lex Wexner, which is deep state money from black operations. And he was manufactured from forces that have hundreds of years of connections. This isn't somebody that, he was manufactured, and there were more Jeffrey Epsteins. And what it is if you, for example, want to be introduced to Donald Trump via Jeffrey Epstein, then you have to be compromised in order to get the introduction. And so his job was to take all of these networks and basically compromise people so that they could get introductions. And the idea is that the higher you want to go, if you want Donald Trump's role, then you have to be more and more degenerate unless you have leverage over the network. And so Trump, for example, he has leverage over the network to a certain degree because he's got a cult following that will forgive him for anything. Anything could come out and they'll say, no, he's playing 5D chess. So that gives him a little bit of leverage and uniqueness in negotiating against the compromise network. But the compromise network is in charge here, and so that's how these Epstein files work. And if you want to go to the highest level, then they need you to be involved in photos and videos of demonic cult rituals, or even sacrificing your first child. Depends how high you want to go in power. And at the highest in power are the most compromised. Starts with a little bit of investment and financial transactions. That creates a dependency. Once you have a financial dependency, then you start, then you ask for more contacts. And as you get more contacts, you have to be more and more compromised until you're something at the top of the chain. And it's a mafia. You're not like some people ask, well, once you got $1 billion, who cares about 10 billion? No. Once you're in the network, you have to keep providing value to the network, and you have to keep being compromised further. And if you try and exit the network, then you get Michael Jackson. You're told you're a file, you get smear campaigns in media, and you get taken out if you need to be. And so you can use assassinations, reputational damage, child sex trafficking, all these different degenerate behaviors in order to stop people leaving the network. And that's how power works. And that's what Jeffrey Epstein was. And Jeffrey Epstein himself was no longer useful. So they took him out. Some people think he's still alive. I don't think so. Because he's just not that useful an asset. He's just one of many. And this is not deconstructing the power structure. It's revealing the power structure that backed up the dollar. And that was the strategic route, but it doesn't expose transnational capital. Those are the important things. It's what's not in there that's important. And what is the impact of revealing all this stuff? And then some of the assets may get taken out, the royal family in UK, some of the different things that we've seen. But it's not designed to end the network. It's designed to still be a blackmail ring. So 50% is behind. Some people believe that that's all Israel and Mossad. I think that's a bit of theatrics. I think Israel and Mossad are blackmailed by the same, just as UK is, just as EU is, just as America is. And so, what is the real utility of this? Well, this is telling the world we are moving to multipolarity. Everybody get on track. will reveal a bunch of stuff that weakens the dollar, reveals this, puts to rest some of these narratives, but everyone remain on track because we got the real stuff up here still, and that's still there. And Trump, I don't believe Trump controls it or the DOJ controls it.
So, there was a period back in like the 1800s, 1700s, or like secret societies were super prevalent. Like it was actually pretty common to have a secret society. That was like during the time of the Enlightenment, and you're escaping, the Catholic Church's power. So they had to like embed their teachings and their ideology and symbolism. So like secret societies were awash in the world. But
yeah, we saw more of that in the Epstein files. I'm sure, look, we can't even begin the surface. This is going to create content for years and years to come, like to get through all this stuff. But some of the things that touched my desk, I saw there was a contract where, the current Rothschilds were paying Jeffrey Epstein $25 million in algorithmic and technical software consulting. That kind of makes a connection between Rothschild power networks. There were emails around connecting. What else did I see? Oh, the Vatican Bank. So it revealed some of the things we know about the Vatican Bank. That was, the Vatican has always been used in order to do some of these. They get a cut because it's the Vatican Bank is not connected to European, Bank Secrecy Act compliance rules. And so all of the black op operations, the CIA, the Mossad, the MI6 funding, that was always done via Vatican Bank and its network. And the Vatican would get like a cut of all the different transactions, from sex trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, drugs trafficking. Some of those connections were revealed in different emails while Jeffrey Epstein was talking about these different things. There was, as I said, the whole militias and ISIS, Al Qaeda being connected to Western intelligence. There is so much that was revealed around these older networks. There was also confirmation that Hitler was hosted by Rothschild families.
And the Epstein family too. They mentioned the Epstein family, the Rothschild family, and there's one other family that was involved.
Yeah. And again, I'm not doing a good job right now, so please do fact check this all in the comments and stuff. But I put out a bunch of the things that I thought was most interesting. Look, this is just emails. This could also be red herrings. We don't know any of this. But this is the fog of information that we're in right now as we are making these major transitions. But I would say, the things that I've always talked about that people would traditionally say are conspiracy theories, I've got way more confirmation and conviction around 90% of all the things that I understand around how the world really works and who rules the world. And almost all of it was confirmed. Maybe I've got some confirmation bias here, but almost all of it was confirmed with different things that I've seen within this Epstein file drop so far.
Yeah. So I kind of feel the same way as well, but it has vindicated a lot of us throughout the years who have been studying this stuff, covert politics, secret societies, all this other jazz. Anything else you want to talk about, Simon, before we take this thing home, or did we cover everything?
One subject I've got to talk about was Bitcoin and the Epstein files. So it's very clear that so Bitcoin was a white paper in 2008. My belief is that it came from DigiCash, which was a project by David Chom, and they got taken out by, for being centralized. And I believe from that, they created an open source version. And I personally believe Satoshi was Len Sassaman and also Hal Finney. There was a white paper in 2008. The code was released in 2009. Gavin Andreessen was one of the first Bitcoin developers, and there were other Bitcoin developers. And then round about 2011, it was confirmed, and I got confirmation by Amir Taki, that Jeffrey Epstein was trying to figure out who's the who in Bitcoin. And so that implies to me it wasn't created by Jeffrey Epstein, clearly. The evidence points towards, which is what some people are saying. But in round about 2011, he did start putting out the feeders and start trying to invest in privacy coins. So Amir Taki was the person that invited me to the first Bitcoin conference in 2011. And he was working on a project called Darkcoin, and a privacy coin that later became known as Dash and various other things. And so it looked like Jeffrey Epstein was trying to fund privacy coins and tapping up the who's who in Bitcoin development. Now, we also saw that in 2014, there was a conversation between Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein talking about how to discredit Bitcoin, and talking about things like stable coins and those types of things. This is around about 2014. At this time, this is when the Bitcoin Foundation that was funding Bitcoin developers through a conglomerate of important Bitcoin companies at the time, you can see that he started to try and invest in these different companies. And Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein, there were various investments. Jeffrey Epstein invested in Coinbase, in the early rounds, and also invested in Blockstream, which is essentially a company that spun off from some of the Bitcoin core developers. And what we saw here is that you had the Bitcoin Foundation, and then you had a spin-off called Blockstream. Jeffrey Epstein funded that. And then you had Brock Pierce implanted, who has a very shady history with child sex allegations and various other things. He was inserted into the Bitcoin community, and he was the one that brokered Jeffrey Epstein's investment in Coinbase. He also created a company that was a dollar-backed stablecoin called Realcoin that later was rebranded when it was sold to a company called Bitfinex to Tether. And so I think it's very clear that Jeffrey Epstein wanted to infiltrate developers within Bitcoin. He also wanted to infiltrate the creation of stablecoins, and he also wanted to invest in privacy coins. He went on to invest in Zcash, which is a private version of Bitcoin. He was looking at these Darkcoin at the time, from what I can tell. Again, this is all just me piecing together information with things that I remember from being involved in the early days of Bitcoin. And clearly, my long-term thesis is, why would this open source version of DigiCash that became Bitcoin, why would it be released? Now, there's no backdoor because it's a decentralized network of supercomputers. The code is open source. You have Bitcoin improvement proposals. Anybody can contribute to the code, and you have to get consensus, and anyone can run a node. And if you don't like that version, you can run a competing, so the infrastructure isn't tarnished. But there were attempts to try and infiltrate parts of the infrastructure. Now, why would it be open source? To me, it was always the theory that made the most sense was that it is to create a gateway drug for a central bank digital currency. And so what we saw next is that he started, the Bitcoin Foundation was discredited. We had arrests from some of the members. We had other members that are now being done for tax evasion. We had Brock Pierce implanted, and he also met Jeffrey Epstein. And so we then saw that the Bitcoin Foundation was discredited and bankrupted. And then Jeffrey Epstein invested in MIT University lab, like an innovation lab that had a spun-off called Digital Currency Initiative that then funded 3 of the Bitcoin developers. And so then you had this email communications back and forth confirming that. But eventually, what did DCI do? It ended up creating a lab for central bank digital currencies. And then Brock Pierce created Tether, a stable coin. And then Jeffrey Epstein invested in privacy coins. And then Blockstream received funding from Jeffrey Epstein that later Adam Back, allegedly, who was the CEO of Blockstream, he came out on X and said that they divested. But what did Blockstream, and if you look at Adam Back and his history, started as a cypherpunk, was involved in many, many Bitcoin debates around future codes. He didn't control the whole narrative, but influenced certain aspects. And now he promotes Bitcoin treasury companies, is working with Howard Lutnick, who was also in the Jeffrey Epstein side, many, many mentions. He created all this, Cantor Fitzgerald, which was creating all these Bitcoin treasury companies. We also had implications from Gary Gensler, who was chair of the SEC when we had Operation Choke Point 2.0. And so everything you're seeing right now with Bitcoin treasury companies, stable coins, crypto capital, all the things that aren't Bitcoin in self-custody, were, I think, clear operations in order to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible and also influence the code in different factions. Also, I remember Brock Pierce. I was at a conference once and he tried to persuade me that Satoshi Nakamoto was Craig Wright. It was Gavin Andreessen, who was one of the coders that was funded, that then went out and said that Satoshi Nakamoto, he has cryptographic proof that the Satoshi wallets are owned by Dr. Craig Wright, which turned out to be completely false in the end. And so when you look at that, I think Bitcoin Cash was also a PSYOP to try and fork the code and control the code in a more centralized structure. And Blockstream was a mechanism for influencing what they could in the decentralized network. And then Brock Pierce was a mechanism for creating a stable coin that is now turning into, through the Genius Act and Clarity Act, the surveillance state Orwellian nightmare, connected to Peter Thiel, who was originally trying to do the destabilization campaigns, and also Elon Musk, who lied about the fact that he was actually requesting to bring his wife to Epstein Island. And Adam Back also, there was confirmation that travel was arranged for him to go to one of the islands to meet Jeffrey Epstein. So all this to say is that most people are getting the narrative completely wrong because they're going for the easy narrative. The reality is this had multiple attack vectors. There was emails around trying to compromise Michael Saylor, who's centralizing a bunch of Bitcoin into Wall Street. All of this to say is that, to me, the decentralized nature of Bitcoin survived all these attack vectors, but we have lots of exposing to do to try and make sure that we get out all of the compromised elements of it and make sure that it still maintains its consensus. But people are just going for the easy narrative that Bitcoin means you're supporting pedophiles and you're involved and you're a Mossad agent. See through that. They want you to sell your Bitcoin. They want you to centralize your Bitcoin. They want to try and influence parts of the infrastructure, but it's still the most decentralized thing that we actually have. And if in doubt, I think we still got, if you can put gold in self-custody, there are operations around what Bitcoin is, but I still think this is a fixed asset, multipolar world transition. And we're going to learn a lot more, but I think it proved its fragility to these attack vectors.
Wow. It's all the data dump when I'm talking to you, Simon. I can't help but just sit there and listen. But thank you so much for your time, my friend. And guys, I'd like to remind you, this episode is probably going to get squashed by the algorithm because of all the stuff we talked about. So please help and do your part. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification, comment down below. Do whatever you can to raise the engagement on this video, because I know for damn sure they're going to try and squash this video considering all of the things that we touched on here. Simon, thank you so much for coming on, my friend. Where can people find you if they want to see more of your work?
I'm giving live updates in real time on X at Simon Dixon Twit. I'm sure you'll put the link in the description. And then I'm synthesizing all the data into everything that's happening in Bitcoin and technology, macroeconomics, geopolitics. And I do about 3 to 4 hours every Friday on my YouTube channel, Simon Dixon. And if I get wiped out or taken out, then I've created a bit of a decentralized structure where I host everything on simondixon.com as well.
Excellent. We'll have the link to your websites and your socials down below for everyone to check out, which I highly suggest you do. And of course, guys, as I always say, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, do all that jazz, and type "Go Simon Go" in the comment section, and let me know if you agreed or disagreed with anything we talked about today. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff to nibble on. So let me know your thoughts. I do, in fact, read all the comments. And if you'd like to support us monetarily as well, we do have a whole host of affiliate links in the description box too that can go into supporting the channel. So I much appreciate it for your time, guys, and I will catch you next time.